Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into one of the absolute most chilling cases of youth criminality out there. You know, the early years of a child's life are incredibly foundational, right? The amount of love, attention, and care you receive heavily dictates the personality you eventually develop. But what happens when that foundation is completely shattered from the very beginning? Today, we're looking at the deeply unsettling story of Mary Bell, focusing on the psychological backdrop of her actions.
So it brings us to this huge foundational question. Can a severely traumatic childhood literally turn an 11-year-old into a killer? That's the heavy nature versus nurture debate we're unpacking today, using the tragic timeline of Mary Bell to neutrally explore the extreme psychological impact of early neglect. It's a case that forces us to look at childhood through a completely different lens. Are some people simply born with a dark nature, or can the environment around a young kid warp them into someone who lacks all empathy? Let's unpack the facts of the case and trace the psychological damage right back to day one.
Section 1, a traumatic upbringing, the crucial formative years.
To really grasp the psychological backdrop of these crimes, we first have to look at the severe breakdown in care starting from the literal moment Mary was born. On May 26, 1957, in northern England, Mary was born to a 17-year-old mother named Elizabeth Bell, who went by Betty. Betty, who worked as a prostitute, was frequently absent due to traveling, and she'd often leave Mary with total strangers for days at a time. But the rejection started immediately. Upon giving birth to Mary, Betty allegedly told the doctor, "Take this thing away from me." I mean, hearing a mother referred to her own newborn as a thing is our first massive indicator of the hostile, broken environment Mary entered into.
And unfortunately, it only gets worse from there. This timeline brilliantly illustrates the extreme, stacking trauma she suffered by the age of 5, creating an environment that left her emotionally numb and profoundly damaged. Just look at this list. Her mother completely ignored her childhood injuries. In 1960, when Mary was just 3 years old, her mother literally pushed her out of a first-floor window in a fit of rage. Miraculously, Mary survived but suffered head injuries. She was fed sleeping pills by her mother in hopes she just wouldn't wake up. She was even nearly sold to a mentally unstable woman at a train station before her family had to step in. And most horrifically, by age 5, she was subjected to abuse by her mother's clients for money. It is almost impossible to comprehend the psychological toll this takes on a developing brain.
Okay, quick pause here because we need to clarify a crucial detail before we move forward, just to avoid any confusion. Mary's only friend was her neighbor, Norma Bell. And while they share a surname, they are absolutely not related. They were just neighbors. Mary was wildly unpredictable with severe mood swings and violent outbursts, while Norma was highly submissive and easily intimidated by Mary. This dynamic is going to become super important as we look at the events that unfold.
Section 2, escalation of violence, red flags, and unpredictable behavior.
As Mary grew older, all this internal trauma, which was evidenced by things like bedwetting until age 9, a classic psychological sign of severe stress, by the way, began manifesting outwardly. It turned into extreme, unprovoked violence against other kids. On May 11, 1968, she asked a 3-year-old boy this deeply unsettling question: "What happens if you choke someone?" She then proceeded to squeeze his neck until his skin literally turned purple, only stopping when other children intervened. It was an incredibly dark preview of what was about to happen.
And this wasn't an isolated incident. Despite these massive flashing red flags where Mary injured multiple children on the exact same day, local authorities completely missed a critical chance to intervene. Earlier that day, Mary had actually pushed that same 3-year-old boy off a 7-foot roof and tried to choke him in the sand alongside Norma. Oh, and she choked 2 other girls that day too. When police questioned Mary and Norma, they denied the whole thing. Local authorities warned the school, but they took no serious intervention steps to get her psychological help. You really have to wonder, if they had stepped in then, could the tragic events of the following weeks have been prevented?
Section 3, the first victim, the death of Martin Brown.
Just 2 weeks later, the violence escalated terrifyingly fast, reaching a fatal turning point. Let's look at this timeline. Starting on May 25th, 4-year-old Martin Brown is found deceased in an abandoned Victorian house. Now, what's really interesting from an investigative standpoint here is that there were no outward signs of violence on Martin's body, only some froth and a bit of blood at his mouth. Because of an empty aspirin bottle found nearby and the lack of physical trauma, police initially suspected natural causes or maybe an accidental poisoning. But the timeline definitely doesn't stop there.
Get this. The very next day, May 26th, which actually happened to be Mary's 11th birthday, she and Norma broke into a local nursery and completely trashed it.
But look at the notes they left behind, reproduced here with their original spelling errors. The police literally dismissed this nursery break-in as a childish prank, completely ignoring the horrifying written confessions left on 4 separate notes right at the scene. And then, 3 days later, Mary casually knocked on Martin Brown's mother's door, asking to see Martin. When his grieving mother said no, Mary coldly replied, "I know he's dead. I just want to see him in his coffin."
Section 4. The second victim. The murder of Brian Howe.
Now, what's really heartbreaking about this explainer is how the violence hit its peak just 2 months later. 3-year-old Brian Howe went missing after playing with Mary and Norma. His family launched a massive nighttime search party, and tragically, his body was found hidden in a nearby playground area. He had been sandwiched between large concrete blocks and covered up with grass and weeds to try and conceal the crime.
When forensic profiling looked at the scene, they quickly deduced that the killer had to be a child. The force used was minimal, and the handprints left on the victim were just way too small to belong to an adult. But there were these deeply disturbing, cruel elements added to this crime. Brian's hair was cut strangely, the letter M was actually carved into his body with a razor blade, and a pair of broken scissors was left at the scene. Additionally, forensic teams found unidentified gray and maroon fibers on Brian's clothes that did not belong to anyone in his household.
Section 5. The investigation. Catching an 11-year-old killer.
So how do you catch an 11-year-old killer? Well, with over 1,200 local children interviewed during a massive manhunt, investigators quickly zeroed in on Mary and Norma since they'd been openly seen playing with Brian that day. And the crucial turning point is how Officer James Dobson caught Mary in a lie. During questioning, Mary and Norma gave totally conflicting stories. Trying to sound believable, Mari told police she saw an 8-year-old boy hitting Brian with a pair of scissors, and she specifically noted that the scissors were broken or bent. Boom. That was her fatal mistake. The detail about the broken scissors at the crime scene had been strictly withheld from the public. Only the actual killer could possibly know that. Shortly after, Norma's parents contacted the police, and Norma fully confessed, explaining how Mary had taken her to the body and even demonstrated how she strangled the poor boy.
But Mary doesn't just crack right away. Even when confronted by Officer Dobson with the evidence in Norma's confession, Mary showed incredible, chilling cunning for an 11-year-old. She demanded legal representation, telling Dobson, "You are trying to brainwash me. I will get a solicitor to get me out of this." I mean, she understood legal concepts that most kids her age couldn't even grasp. Eventually, though, realizing she had absolutely no way out, she admitted to the crime.
And then there's this highly disturbing moment that happened at Brian's funeral. Officer Dobson observed Mary standing right at the cemetery gates, rubbing her hands together and laughing out loud as Brian's coffin was carried by. It was a display of utter emotional numbness that cemented Dobson's resolve, and it led to her immediate formal arrest that very evening.
Section 6. The trial and verdict. Justice and the aftermath.
The subsequent trial brought both girls to court, but the forensic evidence, specifically those maroon and gray fibers that matched Mary and Norma's clothing, and their vastly differing psychological profiles, led to very different legal outcomes. Norma was acquitted of all charges. The jury recognized she was entirely submissive to Mary's dominance and didn't physically harm the boys. Upon hearing her verdict, Norma actually clapped her hands in joy. Mary, however, who actually cried sitting behind her friend when she saw that reaction, was convicted of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility, meaning her mental state impaired her culpability. She was sentenced to indefinite detention, bearing the full weight of the law for the lives she took.
Which really leaves us with a profound, unsettling final thought for this explainer. Did Mary's horrific, abusive upbringing inevitably forge her actions? And when early childhood psychological damage of this magnitude occurs, creating a shell completely devoid of empathy, can society ever truly repair it? Take these facts, review the details, and let this complex intersection of trauma and criminality sit with you. Thanks so much for joining me today, and we'll catch you next time.